Silence in the room. This is the tragic Flight 102 from Kitale to Nairobi, operated by FlySAX. Welcome back. This week, we're going to look at the tragic flight from Kitale to Nairobi operated by FlySAX that had an accident at Elephant Hill in Aberdare's range, and hopefully what we can learn out of it. On June 5th, 2008, a Cessna Caravan model 208B operated by FlySAX rammed into one of the hills at Aberdare's range while en route from Kitale all the way to Nairobi.
At the Kitale airstrip, an aircraft belonging to the East African Safari Air Express, otherwise known as SAX, takes off into the skies. This is the first flight undertaken by the company from this airstrip since another of its planes crashed into the Elephant Hills within the Aberdare ranges. That ill-fated crash took the lives of all the 8 passengers and 2 crew members on board.
The inquiry into the cause of the tragic FlySAX plane crash has revealed that the detour to Jomo Kenyatta International Airport instead of the original destination of Wilson Airport was requested by the airline company. The Kenya Civil Aviation Authority, while releasing the preliminary report, cited a passenger emergency caused by a flight delay as the reason for the detour.
Into the cause of the FlySAX aircraft accident that killed 10 people in the Aberdares in June last year, blamed the pilot and her first officer for professional negligence and poor communication that led to the crash.
There were 10 people on board, including the pilot and the co-pilot, and all of them perished in this accident. Before we get started, let's look at the Cessna Caravan plane. This is a short-haul plane run by the turboprop engines, mostly used for VIP and other short distance travel. It's the most typical plane you'd find that goes to Masai Mara and other places where you need to have bespoke tourist travels, mostly in Kenya and other parts of Africa. So on this fateful day, this same aircraft with the 2 pilots started off from Wilson Airport and flew to Homa Bay, dropped some people, picked them back, brought other people back to Nairobi, and then flew on multiple hops to Masai Mara, came back to Nairobi, and then flew to Kitale to pick up some passengers to bring them back to Nairobi. So the Kenyan government, through the State Department of Transport, finally released the full report about what happened with all the details that were there. So let's examine this flight from departure at Kitale Airport all the way up to the last known location where data was being recorded. So this flight started off at about 4:05, took off from 4:05 from Kitale Airport. Kitale Airport does not have air traffic controller, so the pilot requested to climb up to flight level 11,000 from the Eldoret air traffic controller, which was granted. And the plane maintained this air level while flying. From the report, there is now communication between the air traffic controllers and the pilot. So one of the things that happened within this flight, 2 passengers in the flight were Fijian nationals, and they were scheduled to have a flight from a JKIA traveling out of the country, and was concerned that these 2 people were going to miss their flight. So FlySAX asked the pilots, instead of flying to Wilson Airport, if they can fly directly to JKIA to enable these 2 passengers be able to make their flight in time.
There were some passengers that were making a connecting flight at Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. So company called the crew and told them to route via Jomo Kenyatta, drop the 3 passengers first, then proceed on to Wilson Airport so that those passengers could not miss their connecting flight.
So in this case, after climbing to 11,000 feet, then the pilot requested to route directly to Avena from the report. And Avena is a navigational point denoting Jomo Kenyatta Airport. Now, while at this journey, this communication between the air traffic controller and the pilot reveals some very interesting bits of information. To get started with, when the Eldoret flight air traffic controller switches over the flight to JKIA, there had been some miscommunication because the JKIA flight ATC, which is the air traffic controller, assumed the flight was going to Wilson, and that's what they got from there. So the JKIA controller then asked the pilot to cruise to 13,000 feet and then route to Wilson, where the pilot then requested that, I'm actually going to Jomo Kenyatta. Why is this important? Now, you can see here, within airports, you have what they call an approach chart. All pilots are provided with what you call an approach chart. It tells you, depending on which direction you're going to land your plane, which altitude you should be at what particular distance. And there's several navigational aids that are there that you have to pass through to tell you where you are, and as well what flight level you're supposed to maintain. Now, from the JKIA approach chart, if you're coming from the Nanyuki direction, your minimum altitude is supposed to be 15,000 feet. If you're coming towards Ngong, it's a little bit different. If you're coming towards Machakos, it's different. This is there so that you can avoid obstacles like mountains. Now, on this particular day, the weather report from the area about central Kenya coming to Nairobi, there are very low-hanging clouds and mists in this scenario. So, meaning that the pilot has to fully focus on flying the flight with instruments. In aviation world, you can always fly what you call VFR or IFR. VFR is visual flying reference, or rules, sorry. And then IFR is instrument flying rules. So when in the visual mode, it means you rely on physical features, lakes, rivers, mountains, hills, to tell you where you are. But when it's misty, it's raining, you can't see around, then you switch to electronics. Your altitude, your altimeter, and everything, they become crucial. And this is going to be important in the outcome of this particular flight. So what happened after the pilot was told now you're supposed to, they're switching to fly directly to Jomo Kenyatta. The air traffic controller then at that point had asked the pilot to move to 13,000 feet. But the pilot said because they're going to JKIA, they're going to maintain 11,000 feet in this case. The minimum flying altitude from the Nanyuki direction towards JKIA is 15,000 feet. Reason is because of all the mountain ranges, and the biggest one is Aberdare's range. Now, if we go back to the data on the altimeter, actually this is the altitude data, which was later on gotten from the radar from JKIA. It shows the plane climbed up to 11,000 feet and maintained 11,000 feet up to the point of the accidents. On the Aberdare's range, the highest peak is about 12,300 feet, which means by the time you're getting that section, you either have to avoid the mountain range or go higher. Now, the Cessna Caravan has a maximum altitude of 25,000 feet, which means the pilot could go much higher. But on that particular day, there was a lot of mist as the weather forecast within that particular general area was quite misty and cloudy, which means at 11,000 feet, the pilot was driving straight into the mist. And then The final communication with the air traffic controller, where the pilot confirms that this was about 4:56 p.m., confirms that they're en route to JKA, and then any further communication from the air traffic controller, there was no response.
According to the report, the aircraft is said to have lost radar contact with the tower at 5:02 p.m. while traveling at 289 kilometers per hour at 11,200 feet and failed to clear a ridge, smashing into the mountainside while flying level.
Now, let's go back and look at why did this happen. The whole point of the report that is usually done by the State Department of Transportation is always to figure out why the accident happened and to improve other operations of pilots, operations of airlines, procedures, so on and so forth. So, the first point on this report was about flight planning. Initially, I questioned whether the pilot had flown directly from Kitale to JKA before and passed through the Aberdare range. And that's not indicated in the report, but some of the deduction is that this was a new territory or a new flight area for the pilots. So they didn't have prior information they could rely upon on how to navigate that particular area. So that was accounted to poor flight planning. But then those other that I found interesting, the instruments that were there in the aircraft were recovered. The aircraft did not have a flight data recorder because for that category of aircraft, KCA did not require them to have a flight data recorder. Also, there was no flight voice recorder in this particular aircraft, so couldn't tell what they were saying, and a lot of the instruments, there was nothing collecting all the data and the inputs the pilots were putting in on the aircraft in this thing. Now, there was one navigational equipment that is able to tell whether you're about to hit an obstacle in the aircraft, and so there are two parts to this. So one is called GPWS, which is a ground proximity warning system. It tells you when you're about to hit an object or any traffic you're likely to hit. The other one tells you if you're likely to meet the ground level. So this is called TAWS, which is a terrain awareness and warning system. So this particular navigational equipment was provided by Sardell. I think the model was ST3400, and once it was recovered, it was taken back to Canada, put in a lab, and were able to repair the broken sections and collect the data that were there. So one of the things that they found out was that the radar altimeter, whatever is telling you how far you are from the ground, was not sending information to the equipment that actually tells you about the warning or sends you warnings on the screen. And ideally, when that happens, there's supposed to be a very big warning on the screen. First one shows an X for the TAWS, and then another one shows a written word there that your GPWS has failed. And according to the report, the pilot should have seen that particular error on the screen or warning that was there in the screen and know that in any case they were going to hit a terrain, they'll not be able to detect that, or the warning won't come through. So putting that data together, they figured out that the warning actually came in 4 seconds before impact. Now 4 seconds is very small time. Ideally, how the equipment is designed, this is supposed to be 60 seconds projected flight path. So there will be projected flight paths, and within 60 seconds, if the pilot is supposed to hit an obstacle, then that warning goes up and it gives the pilot enough time to climb or evade this particular obstacle.
Go up.
And that wasn't done in this particular case. The report states that this particular plane hit according to the recorded data that they could get, hit the hill at 155 knots. Yeah. So before we go about knots, we thought about why aircraft speed is measured in knots and not in kilometers per hour. This goes back to the history of aviation. When planes were invented and they needed to create an aviation industry and they needed to train the pilots, there was no manual for training pilots. They couldn't go to horses because horses were different than planes. They couldn't go to cars, how cars were being run, because cars were relatively new. The only industry that had been there for thousands of years was the maritime industry. And they had captains, they had all the structures how to measure everything. If you notice, the uniform of a captain in the sea tends to be the same as the one of the pilot for that. So since there were no speedometers during those ages, there used to be a rope that knots were tied, and then with the weight behind it. So this will be thrown overboard the ship, and then someone will have a timer, and as the time goes, they'll be noting how many knots have sunk as the timer, and then they can say, okay, for each 1 hour, 10 knots have passed.
Go. 1 knot. 2 knots. 3 knots. Time. All right, almost 4 knots.
Or after each hour, 60 knots have passed. So that's how knots were measured. Now back to an accident. So it shows that the pilots were at cruising speed, which means they did not try to make any evasive maneuver. They just rammed straight into this. Now, if we put all this together on the report's recommendation about how what went wrong, so flight planning was not done correctly. There was incorrect use of equipment. That means that they did not look at the altimeters, if they were working or not, and the warning systems that were there. And also it blames, part of the blames to the air traffic controller. They should have warned the aircraft that they're closer to mountain ranges and they should take a different route for that, or give them a different vector to fly in this case. Now, in my whole point, you ask yourself, from a data perspective, what can you learn out of this? Now, this takes me to a very interesting concept that I've been reading about for a while. This concept was known as death by GPS. Back in US, Death Valley in California, the rangers who used to patrol the national park there used to find a lot of people who've just died. So Death Valley has crazy temperatures that get to 40 to 50 degrees Celsius. And a lot of tourists, hikers, people who just want to walk in the park end up dead there a lot. Reason? Because they relied on GPS. So you wake up, they put in a GPS, and whether the GPS is, as long as the GPS has set them into a particular direction, that's where it'll go. And there's so many stories about similar incidences that have happened. One of them was, I think, a couple, I think they were in the US, if not, I think Australia, I'm not sure, but I think it's the US, who wanted to go on a hike. So they put up a GPS on their phones and started hiking and ended up in the house of a serial killer, and then they got murdered in that sense. And they did not take time to look around and figure out, where are we going? Does this place look okay? Why are we veering towards off the road? We're heading towards somebody's house. And if you read about those deaths by GPS, some of them are quite hilarious, where someone is being directed to a sea and they insist, Google says there's a road here, so I'll follow it. And you can check a very funny video that was done by Crazy Kenyan, when Google directs you when you're in the rural area and you end up in people's shamba and rivers and all that kind of thing. And the whole idea is that all these people trusted technology too much. They did not take the time to use their intuition and instinct and other things that we have for making decisions as humans. So in flight 1 or 2, from the flight data, you can tell the captain, in this case, the pilot and the co-pilot, or the pilot and the first officer, set up a flight level of 1100, and they stayed in that particular level. At the time of takeoff, they knew the destination was Jomo Kenyatta, and they'd fixed their flight level at that level. They maintained that flight level until they crashed. From the speed that they were moving, there was no change in speed. And at that time, it was probably that they were flying in clouds. From an instinct perspective, there's something that has to kick in, or should have kicked in this scenario, where you look around. Is everything correct? Are we flying in the same altitude that we were in? And given that they were flying possibly a new route that they're not flown before, there should have been a heightened sense of, we need to look around and figure out, even if the visibility is poor, perhaps we need to rely on our instruments more. So what are our instruments saying? Is it, are they matching up with everything else that we are observing? So it's what you'd call decision making in uncertainty. If you want to go into a new business you've never done, you tend to be more cautious. You tend to put in a little bit of capital, gain more knowledge, expand when you have more information. So when you are lumped with uncertainty, your confidence level is supposed to reduce. And then trust more on yourself and your instinct in this case. So if you trust your GPS tracker more than what you see, then in that case, you're overconfident that the technology is working perfectly. Okay. In this case, if the pilots had not flown the Kitale JKA route before, senses should have been heightened in this case. And one of the blames that are put in the pilot was in the report was that the pilots had not done the flight planning, and the flight planning includes a lot of things: weather, if you're going to use different routes. You even get to choose an alternate airport just in case if your destination airport has bad weather and you can't land, where should we land? So when there is, and that bit of flight planning takes into account the uncertainties you're likely to meet, and the biggest one is always weather in this case. So it gets me thinking about scenarios in life where there is uncertainty and you need to make a decision. Think about a CEO of a company who perhaps wants to release a new product, and they have the legal team, they have the engineering team, the product team, the risk team, and all of these people are advising the CEO. This is the same as having instruments that are giving you information. And then you're supposed to take all this information and then blend it with your intuition and then make a decision. I would wager that the best decisions in life and business are made out of intuition and less from data. Right? Data is just an equipment, just records something and gives you back what it has recorded. If you become more philosophical, you can even go and argue about, can you trust your senses? How do you trust what you've seen is what you've seen for that? So intuition and reasoning becomes a very critical point in decision making for that. There's a lot of arguments when an accident happens, especially air crashes, what role the pilot played in that particular air crash. I think the numbers should be in favor of more pilot errors than mechanical errors, maintenance errors, weather, and other factors. Sometimes it's a combination of all those factors. So after this accident, there was a lot of outcry online, a lot of blame game that usually happens about, they were young and all that kind of thing. The profile of the pilots seems okay. The captain of this particular flight did her CPL in South Africa in 2009, came to Kenya in 2010 and registered or converted her CPL to Kenya, and had about, I think, 300 to 400 flying hours. The co-pilot, the first officer, did CPL to, was rated in several Cessna aircraft, and from the background it seems they're okay to fly this particular flight. They were instrument rated, which means that they've been trained on how to use the instruments and to monitor those particular instruments. My intuition this is the uncertainty. You know, life has uncertainty. You're flying in an unknown area. You're starting a business you've never done. You're meeting somebody you've never known before. Then how do you pair information you're collecting and the decision making that you're about to do? You know, in an ideal scenario, you should never trust instruments 100%. Ultimately, humans have to make decisions. That's why I'm not in favor of all AI things. AI should be mundane things. Yeah. Autopilots do a very great job when the plane is in a certain, not certain, like predictable environment. That's why takeoffs and landings are operated by pilots, and then the cruise phase of the aircraft, because there's little chance of uncertainty creeping in, then autopilot kicks in that area, or the pilots can set autopilot and take a rest or do other, monitor other things. So how do you best make decisions when you're uncertain? Rely on your intuition. Most of the time, it is right. Till next time, click, like, subscribe.
Any Buddha, after kuachieve always subscribe. Apa. Bado je subscribe. Hey, and I have more videos here.